The letter was sitting on my front porch when I got back from shoveling the driveway, half buried under a fresh dusting of snow, like the universe was trying to hide it from me. I almost missed it. I wish I had missed it. I picked it up, brushed the snow off the envelope, and saw that familiar logo in the top left corner. The Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association crest, a little golden house with a little golden tree next to it, which always struck me as ironic because the HOA had been trying to get me to cut down my big oak tree for 3 years running. I stood there in my driveway in 20-degree weather, my breath fogging up in little clouds, my gloves still wet from the shovel handle, and I tore the thing open. It was from Karen Baxter. Of course it was from Karen Baxter. Karen Baxter was the HOA's self-appointed enforcer, a woman who had apparently decided somewhere around her 50th birthday that her life's calling was to make every other homeowner in Maplewood Estates absolutely miserable. She held the title of Compliance and Standards Coordinator, which she had invented herself, and pushed through a board vote on a Tuesday night when only 4 people showed up because there was a blizzard. That was classic Karen Baxter. She always made her power moves during bad weather because she knew nobody else wanted to come out. The letter informed me, in very formal and very aggressive language, that my portable generator, which I had placed in the side yard after the massive ice storm 3 weeks prior had knocked out power to half the neighborhood for 4 days, was in violation of HOA aesthetic guidelines, specifically Article 7, Section 3, Subsection B, which stated that no large mechanical equipment, industrial-grade machinery, or unsightly apparatus could be stored in any visible yard area without prior written approval from the HOA board. There was a deadline at the bottom of the letter. The deadline was in 2 days. The letter also mentioned, almost casually, like it was a footnote, that the city was sending a building inspector to Maplewood Estates that same week as part of a routine neighborhood inspection for a pending rezoning application downtown. Karen had helpfully noted that any HOA violations visible during that inspection could reflect poorly on the community's standards rating, which could in turn affect property values. She framed this as her doing me a favor by warning me. I stood there in the cold reading that last paragraph 3 times, and each time I read it, my blood pressure ticked up about 10 points. Here is what Karen Baxter conveniently left out of that letter. The generator was there because during that ice storm, when power went out to 37 homes on our street, I was the only person on the block who had a generator powerful enough to run a proper extension cord setup. I had loaned power to the Hendersons next door so their elderly mother could keep her oxygen concentrator running. I had run a line to the Patels across the street so their pipes wouldn't freeze. 3 other families had come to my house to charge phones and medical devices. I had kept my generator running for 72 straight hours during a storm that dropped 14 inches of ice-crusted snow and drove temperatures down to single digits. That generator had been genuinely critical, and now Karen Baxter wanted it gone so the neighborhood looked tidy for a city inspector. I folded the letter back up, stuffed it in my jacket pocket, and went inside. The inside of my house was warm, which felt like a small miracle after that week, because my furnace had actually gone out during the storm, and I had been running a propane space heater and the generator to keep from turning into a human popsicle while I waited for the repair guy to fight his way through icy roads. My wife had gone to stay with her sister during the worst of it, which meant it had just been me, the dog, and the generator out there. The dog, a very large golden retriever named Biscuit, was currently occupying the entire couch and did not move when I walked in, so I sat on the armchair and looked at the letter again. I am not someone who rolls over for this kind of thing. I am also not someone who goes nuclear over a piece of paper. I have lived in Maplewood Estates for 11 years. I know my rights, I know my property lines, I know my HOA, CC, and RS front to back, because I made the mistake of reading them cover to cover one particularly boring February weekend 4 years ago. That weekend of reading actually turned out to be one of the best investments of my time I ever made, because it meant that every time Karen Baxter sent me a letter, I could find the exact clause she was misquoting or misapplying. But this time felt different. This time she had thrown in the city inspector angle, and that made the whole thing feel a little more calculated than usual. I pulled out my phone and called my neighbor Dave Kowalski, who lived 2 houses down and had been the informal neighborhood historian and HOA watchdog for as long as I could remember. Dave answered on the second ring. "You get the letter?" I asked. "About your generator." "Yes, she sent me one too." "She sent you one? For what?" "My snow blower," Dave said. "It's been sitting in my side yard since the storm because the storage door froze shut." She's citing me for having outdoor power equipment visible from the street in January in a snowstorm. That is unbelievable. Oh, it gets better. She sent one to the Nuyens about their firewood stack, and she sent one to Tom Garfield about his salt bags near the garage. I sat back in the chair. Biscuit snored. "She's doing a sweep. This is all about the city inspection." "That's what I think," Dave said. "She wants the neighborhood to look pristine for whoever this inspector is. She's been on a kick about property values and the rezoning thing downtown for weeks." "Dave, I need a favor. Can you start calling people? I want to know how many letters went out, and I want copies of all of them if anyone's willing to share." "Already on it," he said, which was one of the many reasons I liked Dave Kowalski. I hung up and opened my laptop. The first thing I did was pull up the Maplewood Estates CC&Rs, which I kept saved as a PDF because I am that kind of person. I went to Article 7, Section 3, Subsection B, the exact clause Karen had cited. I read it twice. Then I read the subsection right above it, Section 3, Subsection A, which Karen had not mentioned. Subsection A contained a very important word that Subsection B did not exist without. The word was permanently. The subsection read, "No large mechanical equipment, industrial-grade machinery, or unsightly apparatus may be permanently stored in any visible yard area without prior written approval." Permanently. My generator was not permanently stored there. It had been there for 3 weeks following an emergency weather event. I had every intention of moving it back to the shed once the shed door, which was also frozen shut, thawed enough for me to open it. This was a temporary situation created by extraordinary winter circumstances, and the word permanently in subsection A modified the entire restriction in subsection B. Karen had simply left that word out of her letter. Whether she left it out by accident or on purpose, I genuinely did not know, but given Karen Baxter's track record, I had my suspicions. I started a document and typed out my notes. The next morning, I woke up to another 2 inches of snow on the ground and a voicemail from Karen Baxter. I sat in the kitchen with my coffee and played it back, and she was her usual combination of professionally polite and thinly veiled threatening. She reminded me that the deadline was tomorrow and that the city inspector was expected sometime Thursday or Friday of that week. She said she hoped I would handle this cooperatively and that she would hate to have to escalate the matter. Then she hung up. I called her back. She picked up on the first ring, which told me she had been waiting for it. "Jim," she said warmly, in that tone she used when she wanted something. "I'm so glad you called. I hope we can resolve this quickly." "Karen," I said, "I read your letter carefully, and I want to make sure we're working from the same document. You cited Article 7, Section 3, Subsection B. That's correct." "Right, but subsection B is modified by subsection A, which specifies that the restriction applies to equipment that is permanently stored. My generator has been there for 3 weeks following an ice storm emergency. It's not permanently stored there. The shed door froze shut, and I haven't been able to access the storage area." There was a brief silence. The CC&Rs don't define what constitutes a temporary versus permanent storage situation. "Actually, they do," I said, because I had found that too. Article 12, Section 1, the definitions section. It says that any equipment present for more than 60 days in a non-enclosed structure is considered permanently stored. My generator has been there for 22 days. I'm well within the definition. Another silence. Longer this time. Jim, the concern here is really about how the neighborhood looks to the city inspector. I understand that, Karen. But I want to be clear that I'm not in violation of the CC&Rs as written. If you want to proceed with any kind of formal action, I'll be asking the board to review the full text of Article 7 along with the Article 12 definitions, and I'll be requesting a hearing. She shifted gears then, which she always did when the rules argument wasn't working. You know, I've gone out of my way to give you advance notice on this. Most people don't get that kind of consideration. I appreciate that, I said, keeping my voice even. But advance notice of a non-violation is still a non-violation. She made a small sound that I can only describe as the noise a person makes when they're trying not to say what they actually want to say. Then she said, "I'll note that you've been informed," and she hung up. I put the phone down and felt pretty good about that exchange, but I also knew Karen Baxter well enough to know that the conversation wasn't over. When she didn't get what she wanted through official channels, she had a habit of getting creative. I had seen it happen to other homeowners. She had once gotten a neighbor's car towed by calling a private towing company and claiming the car was blocking a fire hydrant, even though the car was parked completely legally and the hydrant was 15 feet away. The neighbor had to pay $180 to get the car back before Karen admitted she had made an error in judgment. There was never an apology. There was never accountability. The HOA board was largely made up of people who were either loyal to Karen or afraid of her, and the few members who weren't tended not to stay on the board very long. By noon that day, Dave had collected letters from 8 different households. Karen had sent out 11 violation notices in a 3-day window, all of them related to winter weather items that homeowners had of absolute necessity placed in visible yard areas. Snow blowers, firewood stacks, salt bags, generator units, propane tanks, a sled that one family had left leaning against their fence. All of it cited under various subsections of Article 7 as aesthetic violations, and all of it timed to happen before the city inspection. Dave brought the letters over in a folder, and we sat at my kitchen table and went through all of them together. "Every single one of these involves the winter weather," I said. "Firewood, salt bags, generators, snow equipment. These aren't aesthetic choices. These are functional necessities during a snowstorm." And she cited every single one under Article 7 without mentioning the permanently stored language, Dave said. "She knows what she's doing," I said. Dave poured himself another cup of my coffee without asking, which was fine because Dave was the kind of guy who had earned permanent coffee privileges at my house years ago. "So what do we do?" "I want to talk to the Hendersons," I said, "and the Patels, and Tom Garfield, whoever got a letter. I want everyone in the same room. In this weather, nobody's going to want to drive. They don't have to drive. I'll host it here tonight." That evening, despite the cold and another light snowfall that had dusted the roads again, 9 households sent at least one representative to my living room. I pushed the furniture around and got out every folding chair I owned, and people were sitting on the stairs and leaning against the walls. Biscuit was delighted and kept walking through everyone's legs. My wife had come back by then, bless her, and she made chili and cornbread for the whole group without me even asking, because she understood immediately what this was. I stood in front of the fireplace and went through it all. I explained the permanently stored language. I explained that every single letter Karen had sent was legally questionable under the CC&Rs own definitions section. I explained that the timing was clearly connected to the city inspection and that Karen's goal appeared to be image management for the neighborhood, not genuine rule enforcement. Then I said the part that I had been thinking about since the night before. "Here's what I think Karen is really doing," I said. I think she's using the threat of the city inspection to pressure people into compliance with rules they technically haven't even violated. She's using the inspector as leverage. And I think some of you are scared enough about your property values that you'll move your firewood or your generator rather than fight about it. I understand that. But if we all comply without pushing back, we're setting a precedent that she can do this every time it snows. The room was quiet for a second. Then Alina Henderson, who was in her late 60s and had the kind of quiet strength that comes from raising 5 kids, said, "My mother-in-law's oxygen machine ran on Jim's generator for 3 days during that storm. If Jim's generator violated some rule by being in his side yard, then I don't want to live under those rules." That got a few people nodding and a few more speaking up, and within about 20 minutes we had a plan. The plan had 3 parts. The first part was documentation. Everyone who had received a letter was going to photograph their situation in context, photos showing the snow, the weather conditions, the frozen shed doors, the icy driveways, whatever made it clear that these were weather necessity situations and not permanent aesthetic violations. We were going to create a clear record. The second part was a formal response. I was going to draft a collective letter to the HOA board on behalf of all 11 households, citing the exact CC&R language that made every single one of Karen's notices legally deficient. We were going to request a formal board review and put it in writing so it couldn't be quietly buried. The third part came from an unexpected source. A quiet guy named Marcus Webb, who lived at the end of the cul-de-sac, and whom I honestly had only spoken to maybe a dozen times in 11 years, raised his hand from his spot on the stairs. "I'm a paralegal," Marcus said. "Real estate and property law. I've been listening to everything you're saying, and I think you have a strong case on the CC&R language. But I want to add something. If Karen knowingly sent out violation notices that misrepresented the CC&R text, specifically if she left out the permanently stored qualifier on purpose, and if those notices caused homeowners financial harm or emotional distress, that could actually rise to the level of HOA misconduct under state statute. Depending on the state, HOA officers have a fiduciary duty to enforce CC&Rs accurately and in good faith." The room was very quiet now. "Are you saying she could be personally liable?" I asked. "Potentially, if it can be shown she acted in bad faith or misrepresented the rules to coerce compliance. It would depend on the specifics and how aggressive anyone wanted to get about it." I looked around the room at my neighbors. "Let's file the collective letter first and see how the board responds. But Marcus, would you be willing to help me draft it?" Marcus nodded. "Already mentally drafting it," he said. The meeting broke up around 9, which was late for a school night in a snowstorm neighborhood, and people filtered out into the cold with the particular energy of a group that has decided to stop being pushed around. I cleaned up cups and bowls and thought about what was coming. The next morning, I found a second letter from Karen Baxter in my mailbox. This one was shorter and sharper. It said that because I had failed to commit to removing the generator during our phone call, the HOA was formally issuing a notice of violation with a monetary fine of $150, and that if the generator was not removed prior to the city inspection, additional fines could be levied at the board's discretion. It also noted that noncompliance during an active city evaluation could result in the HOA pursuing legal remedies. I photographed both letters side by side and sent them to Marcus. Marcus called me back within the hour. "She issued the fine before the response deadline in the first letter expired," he said. "Look at the dates. The first letter gave you until tomorrow. She sent the fine notice today." I pulled out the first letter. He was right. I had until the following day. The fine notice had arrived the morning after my phone call with Karen, which was still a full day before my deadline. Karen had jumped the gun, probably because she was rattled by my quoting the CC&Rs back at her and wanted to apply more pressure. "That's procedurally improper," Marcus said. Under the CC&Rs and under state HOA law, a homeowner has to be given a full opportunity to respond before a fine is levied. She didn't give you that. So the fine itself is invalid. Very likely, yes. And if she tries to collect on an invalid fine, that gets into a whole other area of potential liability. I finished my coffee, then went outside to shovel another 3 inches of overnight snow off my driveway. The generator was right there in the side yard, covered in a light dusting of snow, quietly existing, and being absolutely no problem to anyone. I looked at it for a long moment. It had kept my neighbor's elderly relative alive for 3 days. It had kept pipes from freezing in 4 homes. It had charged the cell phones people used to call for help, and Karen Baxter wanted it gone so the neighborhood would photograph nicely. That evening, Marcus and I finalized the collective letter. It was 4 pages long and it was thorough. It cited the exact CC&R text, including the permanently stored language from Article 7 and the 60-day definition from Article 12. It documented the dates of each violation notice sent to each household and the weather conditions on the dates in question. It cited the procedural violation in my fine notice and the expired deadline issue. It cited the relevant state HOA statute that governs good faith enforcement. It requested a full board review, asked that all fines be rescinded, and formally put the board on notice that the homeowners reserved all legal rights. We got signatures from 9 of the 11 households. The other 2 either weren't reachable or didn't want to engage, which was fine. 9 was more than enough. I sent the letter by certified mail to the HOA board's registered address and sent individual copies by email to each board member directly. I also, on Marcus's advice, sent a copy to the HOA's own legal counsel, whose contact information was listed in the association documents. I wanted it crystal clear that the board's own lawyer was aware of the situation. Then I waited. Karen's response came not through official channels, but through the neighborhood. She started making phone calls to homeowners, particularly the ones who hadn't signed the letter, telling them that the collective letter was a legal threat being led by one homeowner with a personal vendetta, meaning me, and that the people who signed it were putting themselves at risk by aligning with someone who was, in Karen's words, habitually non-compliant. I know this because 3 of the people she called told me exactly what she said, almost word for word. This was Karen at her most characteristic. When the rules didn't work, she tried to isolate people socially. She tried to frame me as the problem, as the difficult neighbor, as the guy causing trouble. She had done this before with other people. Usually it worked reasonably well because most people just wanted peace and didn't want drama. What Karen apparently didn't account for was how much goodwill I had built up with the neighborhood during that ice storm. When she called Alina Henderson and suggested that Alina reconsider her support, Alina apparently told her very calmly that Jim Campbell had kept her mother-in-law breathing for 3 days and that she did not intend to reconsider anything. When Karen called Dave Kowalski, Dave just said, "I'll be forwarding this call to Marcus Webb," and Karen hung up. When she called the Patels, Priya Patel told her that if the HOA pursued the violation against their propane heater, which had kept their pipes from bursting during the storm, the Patels would be consulting a private attorney. Karen was not having a good week, but here is where things took a genuinely unexpected turn. On Thursday morning, the city inspector arrived. His name was Robert Fales, a cheerful, competent-looking man in his early 50s who drove a white city-branded pickup and wore an orange reflective vest over his winter coat. He came down our street with a clipboard, politely knocking on doors and introducing himself. He was there to assess the neighborhood as part of the rezoning evaluation I mentioned earlier, not to cite individual homeowners for anything, but to get a general picture of the area's housing stock, street conditions, and maintenance. Karen was out there the moment he turned onto our street. She had apparently been waiting. I saw her from my front window, fully bundled up in a long coat and scarf, walking briskly through the snow to intercept Robert Fales before he could get to anyone else. She introduced herself as the HOA Compliance and Standards Coordinator, and I could see her gesturing and talking at considerable length. I watched from my window for about a minute, then put on my coat and went outside. I walked across the snowy yard and introduced myself to Robert Fales. Karen looked at me the way a cat looks at a dog that has just walked into its territory. "Jim Campbell," I said, shaking the inspector's hand. "I live here. I'm also on the neighborhood response committee that's been dealing with the post-storm situation." "Post-storm situation," Robert Fales said. "We had a significant ice storm about 3 weeks ago. 14 inches of ice-crusted snow, power outages to about 37 homes on this street, temperatures in the single digits. A lot of homeowners have been dealing with frozen storage doors and equipment that had to be kept accessible outdoors as a result." "Ah," Robert Fales said, writing something on his clipboard. "I did see some generators and equipment in side yards. I was going to ask about that." "Standard winter recovery situation," I said. "Most of us are still clearing up from the storm." Karen stepped in smoothly. "The HOA has been working to ensure that residents are aware of aesthetic guidelines and that the neighborhood is brought back to proper standards as quickly as possible." "That's great," Robert Fales said pleasantly. "In my experience, neighborhoods that pull together after a weather emergency are actually very well-maintained communities. The equipment being present suggests people were actively prepared and responsive." He made another note on his clipboard. "I'll note it as weather recovery-related temporary storage." Karen opened her mouth and then closed it again. I excused myself and went back inside. Now, if that had been the end of it, the story would be satisfying enough. The inspector wasn't bothered by the generator. Karen's whole strategy had been built around the idea that the inspector's visit would create pressure to comply, and that pressure had evaporated in about 4 minutes of ordinary conversation. But it was not the end of it, because Karen Baxter did not know how to stop. 2 days after the inspector's visit, I got a call from Marcus. "The HOA board received our letter," Marcus said. "And apparently Karen held a private meeting with 3 of the board members last night without notifying the other 2. "How do you know?" "Because one of the 2 board members who wasn't notified is Ann Suzuki, and Ann called me this morning. She's furious." I knew Ann Suzuki slightly. She was on the HOA board as the treasurer. She was quiet and methodical, and she had always struck me as the one board member who actually read the financial documents instead of just rubber stamping whatever Karen put in front of her. "What happened at the meeting?" Karen apparently told the 3 board members who showed up that the collective letter was frivolous and probably not from a real paralegal, and they should just ignore it and proceed with the fines collection. She also told them that my fine notice was procedurally valid, which is demonstrably false. Can Ann do anything? She can call for an emergency board meeting, which she's doing. She's invoking her right as a board member to convene a full board session to review HOA enforcement actions. She needs one other board member to second the motion, and she already has him guy named Phil Downey. I know Phil. He lives on the east end of the street. Good guy. So the full board is meeting next Tuesday. Ann has invited all 11 homeowners who received violation notices to attend and speak. "Marcus," I said, "I think we need to show up to this meeting." "Already planning on it, and I've been doing a little more research. I found something you're going to want to know about." He paused, and I could hear him shuffling papers. The HOA board voted on Karen's Compliance and Standards Coordinator title and the enforcement authority that came with it about 4 years ago. I pulled the meeting minutes. The vote was on a February night during a blizzard. 4 people present. The quorum requirement for that board is 5. They didn't have quorum. I sat down. The vote was invalid. The vote was invalid. Which means Karen's title, and more importantly the enforcement authority attached to it, was never legitimately granted. Every violation notice she's ever sent, every fine she's ever levied in her capacity as compliance and standards coordinator is procedurally questionable. Not just the recent ones. All of them. The quiet in my kitchen felt loud. How far back does that go? I asked. 4 years. And if the board tries to ratify the vote retroactively, they have a whole problem with the homeowners who already paid fines under that authority. I thought about this for a long time after I hung up. There were people in this neighborhood who had paid Karen Baxter's fines and moved on, not because they were guilty of anything but because it wasn't worth the fight. The Henderson family, the Garfields. Dave Kowalski, who had paid a $50 fine 2 years ago for parking his boat trailer in his driveway for a weekend while he was loading gear for a fishing trip. This was bigger than my generator. The Tuesday board meeting arrived with, naturally, another snowfall. About 4 inches of fresh powder had come down overnight, which meant the roads were slow, and several people arrived late with salt on their boots and cold pink faces. But nearly every household that had gotten a violation notice sent someone, and between them and regular homeowners who had just been following the situation through neighborhood word of mouth, the meeting room in the community center was absolutely packed. Karen was seated at the board table in her official capacity. She was wearing a blazer, and her expression was the particular expression of a person who is absolutely certain they are going to win and has never considered the possibility that they might not. Phil Downey and Ann Suzuki flanked her on either side, and the other 2 board members, Frank Mullen and Janet Pierce, were at the ends of the table. Frank and Janet were the 3-member block from the unauthorized meeting, but they were looking slightly less comfortable now that they could see how many people had come out. Ann Suzuki called the meeting to order and immediately invited me to speak first, as the homeowner who had submitted the collective response letter. I stood up and went through it methodically. I was calm, I had notes, and I spoke for about 12 minutes. I covered the permanently stored language, the procedural violation on the fine notice, the winter weather context for all 11 violation notices, the inspector's actual response when I spoke to him in the street, and then I got to the quorum issue. I could see Karen's expression shift when I got to that part. I described the February Blizzard board meeting. I described the 4-person attendance. I described the quorum requirement of 5. I described the vote that had created Karen's title and her enforcement authority. And then I handed Ann Suzuki a copy of the meeting minutes from that night, which Marcus had obtained through the HOA's own records request process, completely legally and in advance. Karen said, "This is not the appropriate forum for Karen," Ann Suzuki said, in a tone I had never heard from Ann before, quiet and very final. "You will please let the homeowner finish." Karen closed her mouth. I sat down. Marcus stood up next and walked through the legal dimensions with the particular calm confidence of a man who had spent years doing this in professional settings and wasn't the least bit intimidated by a community association boardroom. He covered the fiduciary duty angle. He covered the state HOA statute on good faith enforcement. He covered the remedies available to homeowners who had paid fines under an improperly constituted enforcement authority. He also covered one more thing that I hadn't known about until the day before the meeting. Marcus had been doing research, and he had found that 2 years prior, Karen Baxter had sent a violation notice to a homeowner named George Nakamura, assessed a $300 fine for an unapproved structural modification to George's fence, collected the fine, and then, and this was the part that made the room very quiet, had recommended, in her official capacity, that the board approve a fence contractor to remedy the violation. The contractor she recommended was her nephew's company. The nephew's company had subsequently done $2,000 of work in the neighborhood, all of it referred through Karen's violation notice process, and Karen had received what appeared to be a referral fee based on bank records that George Nakamura had obtained when he started putting the story together after reading about our situation through the neighborhood grapevine. Marcus laid this out clearly, one fact at a time. A referral fee, paid to Karen Baxter. For homeowners, she had pressured into using a specific contractor through her enforcement authority. The room was genuinely silent for a few seconds. Then it wasn't. Frank Mullins said, "I didn't know about that." Janet Pierce said, "Karen, is that true?" Karen said, "This is a gross mischaracterization of George Nakamura." Stood up from the back of the room. He was a quiet man in his 60s who I had barely spoken to before the neighborhood meeting, but he had come prepared. He had a folder. He put 3 printed pages on the table in front of Aunt Suzuki without a word. Then he sat back down. Aunt Suzuki looked at the pages. Her expression didn't change much, but something behind her eyes did. Phil Downey leaned over to look at the pages. Then he looked at Karen. "Karen," Phil said, "these look like bank transfer records with your account number." "This is taken completely out of context," Karen said. Her voice was still controlled, but something in it had shifted, a slight tightness around the edges, the sound of someone whose footing has just become uncertain. "What's the context?" Anne said. "My nephew provided quality services at competitive rates, and I recommended him as a community resource, which is entirely within my role." "Did you disclose the financial relationship?" Marcus asked. "To the board, in writing, before making the referral." The silence that followed that question was the loudest silence I have ever experienced in a community center meeting room. Karen Baxter did not answer. Aunt Suzuki picked up the papers. She looked at them for a moment. Then she set them back down and looked at Karen with an expression that was somehow worse than anger. It was the expression of a person who has decided something, completely and finally. "I'm going to need to pause this meeting," Anne said, "to consult with the HOA's legal counsel." The meeting broke up for about 20 minutes, during which everyone milled around in the snowy parking lot and spoke in low voices. I stood with Dave and Marcus and sipped terrible community center coffee from a small styrofoam cup and said very little. When the meeting reconvened, the HOA's attorney, a woman named Carol Driscoll who had driven over in the snow and still had salt on her shoes, was seated next to Anne at the table. Karen was still in her chair, but she looked different now. The blazer looked too large. The expression was gone. Carol Driscoll informed the board that based on what she had reviewed, there were 2 distinct issues. The first was the procedural problem with Karen's enforcement authority, which needed to be addressed through a proper ratification vote or a restructuring of the compliance process. The second was the contractor referral situation, which involved a potential conflict of interest that, depending on the specifics, could constitute a breach of fiduciary duty and potentially fraud. She recommended the board vote immediately to suspend Karen's enforcement authority pending a full legal review. The vote was 4-1. Frank Mullins voted to suspend. Janet Pierce voted to suspend. Phil Downey and Aunt Suzuki voted to suspend. Karen abstained, which was either strategic or an admission of something, depending on how you wanted to read it. Karen Baxter was suspended from all HOA enforcement activities effective immediately. 2 days later, George Nakamura filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Office regarding the contractor referral scheme. Marcus helped him draft it. Within the week, 2 other homeowners came forward to say they had also been referred to Karen's nephew's company following violation notices from Karen, in transactions they had never questioned at the time but now viewed differently. The state took it seriously. They opened an inquiry. I do not know all the details of what happened in that process, because a lot of it happened over the next several months and is not entirely my story to tell, but I know the outcome. Karen Baxter paid back the referral fees she had received, with interest, to the homeowners involved. She was required to resign permanently from the HOA board and all related positions as part of a settlement agreement that also included an admission of improper conduct. She was not charged criminally because the amounts involved fell into a gray area that the AG's office decided did not meet the threshold for criminal prosecution, though the word fraud was used in the official complaint documentation and remained in the public record. I want to be honest with you. There was a part of me that would have liked to see more dramatic legal consequences. I am human. Karen had spent years making people's lives difficult, and she had done it from a position of power she had illegitimately obtained and then abused. The settlement felt, on some level, proportionate but not fully satisfying. But I have thought about this a lot since, and I think the more durable consequence for Karen Baxter was not the money she paid back. It was that everyone in Maplewood Estates now knew exactly who she was and exactly what she had done. She lived in the same neighborhood. She still had to drive past the same houses. She still occasionally got her mail from the same mailbox cluster. And every single person who had a generator or a snow blower or a salt bag in their side yard now looked at her differently. That is a long time to carry. Meanwhile, the HOA itself went through what Ann Suzuki described as a structural reset. They held a proper quorum meeting, conducted with all board members present and verified, and formally restructured the compliance process. The enforcement role was eliminated in the form Karen had held it, and replaced with a 3-person volunteer compliance committee that required any violation notice to be reviewed and co-signed by at least 2 committee members before it could be sent. Fines could only be levied after a formal response period elapsed, in writing, certified. Any contractor referrals had to be disclosed and recused, and also pushed through one more change. The HOA formally adopted a weather emergency exemption clause to Article 7, specifying that any equipment or materials placed in visible yard areas as a direct necessity of a declared weather emergency or extreme weather event would be considered temporarily exempted from aesthetic guidelines for a period of 90 days from the event, provided the homeowner documented the weather circumstances. I had actually suggested this language in a letter to the board, and Anne incorporated it almost verbatim. Marcus, who had done more to help us than anyone had a right to expect from a relative stranger, was elected to the HOA board the following spring. He served for 3 years and by all accounts was excellent. As for me, I moved the generator back to the shed about 6 weeks after the ice storm, when the shed door finally thawed enough for me to get it open. I cleaned the generator, checked the oil, ran it for 10 minutes to make sure everything still worked, and put it away properly. Then I stood in the side yard for a moment in the cold, looking at the empty patch of concrete where it had sat for those weeks, and I thought about Alina Henderson's mother-in-law breathing steadily through the storm, and the Patel's pipes not bursting, and Dave's phone charging enough to call his daughter on day 3 of the outage, and I felt pretty good. My wife came out and stood next to me. "It's gone," she said. "Yep," I said. "Was it worth it?" I thought about the letters and the phone calls, and the meeting at my house with chili and cornbread and folding chairs on the stairs, and Marcus Webb standing up in a community center boardroom with a folder of documents, and Ann Suzuki's voice going quiet and final, and George Nakamura walking to the front of the room in silence and setting 3 pages on a table. "Yeah," I said. "I think so." Biscuit ran across the yard and plowed into a snowbank face first, which he did at least once a day and never seemed to learn from. He came out shaking snow from his ears, tail going 100 miles an hour, absolutely delighted with himself and the snow and the cold and the world in general. I went inside and made coffee, and it was warm in the house and the generator was in the shed, and that was exactly where it belonged. There is one thing I want to add, because it is the part of this story that I think about the most when I'm being honest with myself. The whole thing, the letters, the fine, the inspector visit, the board meeting, all of it, could have gone completely differently if any of us had just rolled over. If Dave had moved his snowblower without asking questions. If Alina had been too tired to come to the meeting. If Marcus had not happened to be sitting on my stairs with his particular background and his particular willingness to speak up. If Ann Suzuki had not been the kind of person who reads the documents and picks up the phone when something is wrong. Karen Baxter had built her operation on the reasonable assumption that people, When confronted with official-looking paperwork and vague threats about property values, would generally just comply. And she had been right about that for 4 years. She had been right until an ice storm put a generator in a side yard, and a group of neighbors who had spent 3 days helping each other stay warm decided they were not particularly interested in being told that doing so was a violation. I shoveled my driveway a lot that winter. I shoveled it nearly every other day from November through March, and every time I came around the corner of the house past the side yard, I saw the empty spot where the generator had been, and every time I thought about Karen Baxter's letter with its carefully omitted word, and I thought about how much difference one word can make. Permanently. She left it out and it cost her everything she had spent 4 years building. Dave Kowalski stopped by in early March, right after the last significant snowfall of the season, on one of those afternoons where the sun is actually warm enough to make the snow on the rooftops start dripping. He stood in my driveway with his hands in his pockets, and we talked for a while about nothing in particular: his daughter's soccer season, the new family that had moved in down the block, whether Phil Downey was going to redo his front walk in the spring. Eventually he said, "You know, Karen's trying to start a garden committee." I looked at him. "Completely separate from the HOA," he said. "Just a neighborhood garden thing, voluntary participation." I thought about this for a second. "Does she need to get any permits for it?" Dave smiled. "That's the question, isn't it? Let's just keep an eye on it," I said. He nodded. We stood there a little longer, watching the snow melt off the eaves in long, slow drips, the particular blue winter sky going golden at the edges toward the west, the neighborhood quiet and cold and completely ordinary. The generator was in the shed. The HOA had clean bylaws and a proper compliance process, and a board member who actually read things. The people on this street had learned something about what they were capable of when they stopped looking at the ground and started looking at each other. That was enough. That was more than enough. When spring finally came, I opened the shed door and pulled the generator out for its annual maintenance check, the way I do every year. I ran it for 20 minutes, checked all the connections, added a fuel stabilizer, and put it back. It was ready. If the power went out, if another storm came, if someone needed it, it would be there. It was always going to be there. That was the whole point.